To hear what the Australian Executive Council of Jury has to say about it, I've spoken to Alex Ryvchin. He's the co-chief executive at the Executive Council of Australian Jury, and he joins us on the line. Thanks very much for your time, Alex.
Thank you, Gary.
Just in terms of Ed Husic, one of the things he says is that that Australia should really be joining with the European countries and Canada in putting more pressure on Israel. What do you think of that?
I think it probably comes from a good place. And, you know, having met with Ed before over the years, I think he's a thoroughly decent person and he cares about civilian life and human life. Having said that, I know a lot of people in the Jewish community who had very close relationships with him felt very let down by his silence on October 7 and the immediate aftermath of that. But regardless of that, I'm sure he wants to see a peaceful solution to this. I'm sure he wants to see an end to the war, an end to civilian suffering. But sanctioning Israel is the entirely wrong way to go about it. I mean, we need this war to end. And the only way this war ends is with the defeat of Hamas, with the liberation of its own people, with a free and peaceful existence for the people of southern Israel so they don't have to live with the threat of terrorism any longer. And putting more pressure on Israel just plays into the agenda of Hamas. It forces them to dig in, to play for time, thinking they'll eventually score a political victory out of all this.
But does defeating Hamas come at the cost of children's lives more and more, just in terms of aid not getting through and malnutrition that we're seeing more of?
Look, I think it's a tragedy, and sadly it's the nature of war. For the first 16 months of this war, Israel was allowing a lot of aid into the territory. You had about 100 trucks going in every day, each one carrying about 25 tons of food and clean water and supplies. And all that was happening was that Hamas was using that to run a black market, to extort its own people, to feed and pay its own fighters and induce others to join them. And there were still accusations that Israel was starving the population. Now Israel's taking a different approach, admittedly a firmer and a harder approach, in the hope that this war ends quicker and that there can be genuine peace for the people of Gaza and for the people of Israel. It's a tragic situation, but the only way this can end is with the defeat of Hamas, sadly. And I think that all of these calls for Israel to, you know, allow more aid in, I mean, they'll provide a momentary respite for the people in Gaza, but the people in Gaza need an end to the war. The people of Israel need an end to this war as well. And the only way that can be achieved is through international pressure with one voice, with clarity to Hamas to say, you will not succeed, lay down your arms, and for the good of your own people, go. That's how this war ends.
But doesn't, you know, imagery of malnutrition in children and the images of children with bowls, you know, pleading for food, doesn't that just guarantee that Israel will lose more support for what it's trying to achieve?
Probably. And it's hard not to look at those images and not to feel great sorrow for the people that are suffering. There's no question that when you have a war of this nature, not fought on some strategic battlefield somewhere, but fought in people's homes, in alleys, in streets, in towns that are densely populated, the civilian population will suffer a horrific toll. They've been suffering for 18 months. The hostages being kept underground are suffering horrifically. They're the most starved people of all in Gaza. The people of southern Israel suffered the worst atrocities we've seen in our lifetimes on October 7. This all needs to come to a close. And again, fiddling around the edges with allowing a bit more aid in, of course, that's a good thing. And of course, the international community, and Israel as part of that, should do whatever it can to allow as much aid to get in, to get to the right places as possible. But what really needs to happen is an end to the war. And again, you know, I keep coming back to it, that can only happen with the defeat of Hamas. And what happened for 16 months was that aid was getting in and the war was continuing at a constant pace. And the suffering continued. So I think we need to move to a different strategy. Israel is seeking to set up humanitarian zones in Gaza, which can be cordoned off from Hamas fighters and people can freely access as much aid as they need. And my understanding is that that's being implemented as we speak. But again, these are all kind of trivial short-term solutions to what's a deathly horrific problem that needs a permanent solution.
You don't think Israel can do both, that it can manage to get aid to mothers and their children in relation to the malnutrition issue that I talked about there, and continue to take the fight to Hamas?
I think that that's what it tried. And I think for the first 16 months, with one hand, it was trying to feed the population. and give them instructions to evacuate, to minimize the suffering of those people. And with the other hand, it was trying to crush Hamas. And I think the two are incompatible. President Trump proposed various solutions of mass evacuations of people on a short-term basis to allow Israel to finish the job militarily and then allow people to repopulate the area. But that was met with a strong rebuke from the international community. I think it's an extremely difficult situation. I think Israel's in an impossible situation, and no doubt the people of Gaza are suffering for it.
Our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has been using stronger language in the last sort of 48 hours than he perhaps had before, talking about it being outrageous that Israel is not allowing more aid into Gaza. What do you say to that?
Again, I understand the concerns from a purely humanitarian point of view, but from our Prime Minister, we seek more. We want solutions. And if the Prime Minister or Ed Husic can think of a solution, can think of a more effective way to deny Hamas everything while denying the people of Gaza, the peaceful population, nothing, to allow Israel to fight this war and defeat the terrorists and minimize civilian suffering, if they can charter a path, if they can articulate a better way to do it, I would love to hear it. But so far I've heard nothing said, merely criticisms of Israel, which again play into Hamas's hands. I think the international community does itself a disservice with constant statements of condemnation, but also balancing statements which on the one hand talk about the hostages and the fact that Hamas can play no role in the future of Gaza. That's all good and well, and everyone agrees that. But it's inevitably balanced with very harsh criticism of Israel. And I think that the two end up kind of cancelling each other out. If the world spoke with one clear voice telling Hamas to go, that their strategy won't succeed, I think that would be far more effective and would serve the people of Gaza a lot better.
Yeah, and the world is fracturing, though, on that, as with England, of course, and Canada and France making the statements and pledging to introduce sanctions. Can I ask you what your thoughts on Ed Husic believing that it's time to bring in the Israeli ambassador and tell him in no uncertain terms that the blockading of aid has to stop?
Well, again, the sentiment underlying it, I can understand, but the solution he's proposing is no solution at all. The Prime Minister himself a couple of days ago said that he spoke with the Israeli president in Rome and conveyed to him his concerns about malnutrition and the need to get supply of aid in. So to bring the Israeli ambassador in is really beside the point. It doesn't achieve anything new. Again, I keep coming back to it, Gary. The whole thing has been a horror show since October 7th. I spoke to Australian journalists who were on the ground a day after the massacre, and they were weeping from what they saw. They've never seen such barbarism. The people of Gaza who've been living under bombardment for 18 months must be living in absolute terror. This is a horrific situation caused by a war that Hamas declared and chose that Israel never wanted. And we all want this war to end, and we don't want any more temporary ceasefires or 150 trucks to get in rather than 100 trucks to get in. It doesn't achieve anything in the long term. We want this war to end, and that can only happen with the disarmament and the surrender of Hamas. And I think that's what the Prime Minister and that's what Ed Husic and all decent people should be calling for.
Just finally, though, how long could that take, and how many, let's just talk about babies, how many babies would have to die through malnutrition to get to an end game?
Look, I don't know how long it would take. I think few people expected this war to take as long as it's taken. But Hamas digs in, and they're fighting for an unknown purpose. Militarily, they can't succeed. And every day that people suffer as a result of it, their own people suffer, it's on them. They bear the moral responsibility for this. When German civilians suffered from carpet bombing in the closing days of World War II, that was a result of the Nazi regime. That wasn't the result of the Allies. The moral responsibility fell with the Nazis. And here, the responsibility falls squarely on Hamas. And if they truly care about the future of their people and the lives of their people, they would do the dignified thing and surrender.
Alex, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.